Thank you very much. Naddi l-kelma issa lil-kellim.
We move on to the speakers on behalf of the political groups. On behalf of the group of the European People's Party, for 1 minute and a half, Mr. David McAllister.
Madam President, dear colleagues, I am very concerned and strongly condemn the arrest of Mr. Alexei Navalny upon his return to Russia, just as I am very concerned and condemn the detention of several dozen of his supporters and journalists across the country. The arrest of Mr. Navalny and its modalities clearly contravenes international law and the Russian constitution. I urge the authorities in Moscow to release him and his supporters immediately. Their rights need to be fully and unconditionally respected and enforced. These latest developments further deteriorate the already strained relations between the European Union and Russia. The intimidation and political persecution of government critics in Russia must stop. Dear Josep Borrell, I am thankful for your strong and clear words immediately after the arrest of Mr. Navalny and again this afternoon. Indeed, the politicization of the Russian judiciary is unacceptable. The poisoning and the arrest of Mr. Navalny are just the latest of many arguments to reassess our relations with Russia. As the European Union, we should be very clear in our response and expand the so far introduced sanctions to individuals implied in his arrest and those who gave orders to do so. As of December 2020, the EU has the instrument of a global human rights sanctions regime. We shouldn't hesitate to use this tool when and where necessary. Thank you.
Grazzi issa al.
Thank you. For 1 minute, on behalf of the Socialists, it's Mrs. Santos.
Perseguição.
Alexei Navalny's arrest and the detention of opponents in the Russian Federation is something that is unacceptable. Nemtsov, Politkovskaya, Yushchenko. These are names that we must remember as some of the examples of those who have been critical of the Putin regime and that have been killed. There were 2 attempts to poison Navalny, and he was persecuted a number of times, and he's now being held for a suspended sentence in 2013 in a sentence that I reported as being riddled with irregularities and undermining the rule of law, and in 2018 the ECHR declared it as being politically motivated. Those who are responsible for the poisoning of Navalny remain at large, and meanwhile, Navalny is being held in prison, the prison where Magnitsky died. This is a clear affront to the European Union and to the entire international community. I should like to commend the request for the swift and immediate release of Mr. Navalny, which was just made by the High Representative, and we demand that those who are responsible for this arrest be put on the list of those who are sanctioned.
For 1 minute and a half, Urma Spet.
Dear High Representative, dear colleagues, Alexei Navalny must be released immediately. His arrest is wrong in so many levels, like legal level, domestic politics level, and from international point of view, not to mention on a human level. It takes guts for Alexei Navalny, who has been subject to beatings, harassments, attacks, arrests, and poisoning with a chemical weapon, to return to his homeland and face yet another arrest and sentencing immediately upon his arrival. Once again, we are facing a situation in Russia where the victim is jailed and those responsible for his poisoning walk free. EU must influence Russia to release Navalny immediately, to stop harassing opposition activists and political opposition, to stop using chemical weapons on its own people and start following international law and its obligations taken thereunder. The EU must be united in its approach to Russia, regarding its sanctions policy, but also in its other policy spheres, like energy policy, for example. Clearly, if somebody like Navalny, who has been so badly treated by its own government, the security forces and its political system, still finds in himself such a calling or a mission to return to his homeland to keep fighting for human rights and democratic principles, this must find adequate support on the European Union level as well. Also, the people of Russia deserve full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Issa għal żewġ minuti il-kollega Marco Zanni.
For 2 minutes, Marco Zanni.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner Borrell. What's been experienced in the last few months in the Navalny affair is unacceptable. Democracy should follow certain principles and certain rules, and the European Union and the Member States did well firmly to condemn what has happened. We cannot allow a partner with whom we cooperate and have a dialogue to use the judiciary and possibly assassination to silence political opposition. When it comes to civil rights, human rights and political rights, that must always be at the heart of the relationship between our member states, the European Union and third countries. And therefore we did the right thing at a number of levels, and the international community did well too, to condemn what has happened and to call for clarity and to ensure that the Russian authorities allow the international community to shed light on what has happened in respect of Navalny. However, I believe, Commissioner Borrell, that to be completely credible in its request, the European Union must have a common approach shared with all the third countries with whom we have a dialogue and cooperation. And I think what has happened recently as regards China is not a pellucid example of how the European Union should unanimously, uniformly condemn that sort of conduct in China. There's human rights, civil rights and political rights that are not guaranteed either. And what's happening in Hong Kong shows that. Yet we decide to sign agreements with that country, closing our eyes because of the commercial interests of some. I think that needs to be changed. Otherwise, the European Union and the member states will not be able to be effective in calling for human rights to be respected.
Thank you. For 2 minutes, Sergei Lagodinsky.
Navalny is being punished for doing nothing wrong. He's being punished for daring to survive, for daring to return, for daring to continue fighting. He's being punished for having no fear. We have long forgotten how it is to see people who have no fear, people who are ready to fight, who are ready to go to prison, and yes, who are ready to die for democracy. And now we see those people in Belarus, in Turkey, and now we see them also in Russia and have been seeing them for many years. Some of the names were already mentioned. And Navalny is one of them, one of the people whose term and characterization we forgot to pronounce, one of heroes. And that's him, and that's his family, and that's his wife, Yulia, who is always on his side. And it's important that we mention that we see the human story behind this political story. But Navalny didn't return for a human story, he returned for political work. And it is our responsibility to make sure that his political work and the work of his party, of his foundations, of many other opposition parties in the country where he returned is possible. And we have to call on Putin to allow free space for the upcoming elections, as free as possible under Russian circumstances. And it is impossible, and it is important that we also pronounce our responsibility and responsibility of our governments, just like my national government, the government of Germany, and the government of our federal lands, like the government of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and the responsibility of the Prime Minister of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, who is defending and continues to defend a project that undermines democracy and solidarity with Russian society, with Ukrainian society, with Polish society, and many others. Manuela Schwesig, you have to think about your shameful decisions. Let's stop Nord Stream 2.
Thank you.
For 2 minutes, Witold Wachikowski.
Opresyjną.
May I remind you, dear colleague, that if you would like to speak from your seat, you will have to speak with the mask on.
Nie działa mikrofon. Tu działa. Tu działa.
I think it works now. Yeah.
Yeah. Pani Przewodnicząca, Senior Borrell.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. Borrell. Well, once again, Russia has done it. It's used chemical weapons against its own people, an atrocious crime. And like Dostoevsky, we're asking whether there is a punishment for this crime, because Russia is continuing with the same internal and external policies as before. I think we need an international investigation with the participation of the bodies that oversee non-use of chemical and nuclear weapons. We need to make use of the Magnitsky tool. But will that be sufficient? Would that not exclude certain persons? What about freezing bank accounts, embargo of products? These are costly measures. There are other less costly measures which could end up punishing representatives of sport and culture as well. Oligarchs are not going to send their assets from London to Beijing overnight. Then scientists are not going to leave Harvard to work in Africa. So Russian society, particularly the part that supports Putin, needs to have a taste of the price of this imperial policy pursued by Putin. We need to try many different instruments.
For 1 minute and a half, it's our colleague Villanueva Ruiz.
We join the condemnation of the detention of Mr. Navalny as his return to Moscow after he was poisoned, and this was inhumane. There's no other way to define this, wherever that may happen in the world. This is the second time that we have debated this case in the European Parliament. What are we trying to achieve? Our leadership in democracy, in human rights? We know that Russia is not a part of the approach to the EU in foreign policy in this, because we know that it is a threat to EU security. Now, when we look at the relation that we have when we speak out against human rights and or will we just silence all of this? This European Parliament has to have an instrument so that we can establish foreign policy that defends democracy and human rights within our EU and around the world. We condemn the actions against Mr. Navalny, and we ask this Parliament to speak out and not silence those that taking place in defending women's rights, as well as the fact that we can see that vaccination in Israel, for example, is only being carried out with some people, and then the violations as well of human rights activists in Colombia. Thank you.
Issa għal minuta l-Viċi President Castaldo.
Onorevole Presidente.
President, colleagues, on Sunday in an airport changed just before landing and shut down for the purposes, Alexei Navalny took his first steps back in his country after a long time in a German hospital. And the police and an improvised jury met him there, and his arrest was confirmed and his custody. A suspended sentence was applied for its converting into a normal sentence, and a politically influenced sentence could rule him out of the Duma elections. The rule of law is meant to prevent abuse, the abuse by states and their governments. Democracy means not allowing the majority to impose itself at all costs, but above all protecting the rights of the opposition. And that's why we should speak out loud and clear to the Russian authorities: no to political trials, yes to the immediate release of Alexei Navalny.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Andrius Kubilius for a minute and a half.
Madam Chair, Mr. Vice President, of course, first of all, we express our solidarity with Alexei Navalny and his family. Obviously, we are demanding freedom for Navalny, and we are demanding sanctions to punish those who did it. If Putin would not be afraid of Navalny and of Russian people's demand for change, Navalny would be staying in freedom. This is a manifestation of Putin following the footsteps of dictator Lukashenko. Putin is sharing with Lukashenko the same fear for real elections. Lukashenko was stealing elections from Belarusian people by jailing potential candidates Viktor Babaryka and Sergei Tikhanovsky. Putin is doing the same by arresting Alexei Navalny. Lukashenko has finished the year 2020 with a single question addressed globally and domestically: when and how he will be ousted out of the power. Putin is starting to move the same direction, which may have the same outcome at the end of this year. Putin in some way is a delayed Lukashenko. People in Belarus have clearly shown that majority of them are for change. Russian people are not different, and that is why Navalny was arrested. What we saw during those days is an additional reason to repeat what we have said last year in September. The EU needs to launch a thorough assessment of its relations with Russia and to consider that pursuit of democracy should be the centerpiece of this new EU strategy towards the Russian Federation. Democracy is possible in Ukraine, it is possible in Belarus, and it's possible also in Russia. We're standing together with the Russian people. Thanks a lot.
Grazie.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Kati Piri.
Thank you, President, colleagues, High Representative. The arrest of Alexei Navalny upon his return to Moscow is a show of lawlessness and Putin's utter contempt for the civil rights of his own citizens. Just 4 months ago, Navalny barely survived an FSB assassination attempt, and on Sunday he returned home, defiant, willing to risk his freedom for his cause, to display the corruptness of this regime. While Putin did not succeed to kill him, so now he jails him. And this means that the EU must hold the Kremlin accountable, and not with the weak sanctions we imposed on 6 individuals after Navalny's poisoning. We need to discuss serious sanctions if Navalny remains in jail. And honestly, anyone who still believes that we should continue with Nord Stream 2 is blind for what kind of regime we are dealing with in Moscow. It is time we as well show some bravery. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Bernard Guetta.
Madam, colleagues, let's look carefully, because it's not just a violation of law and freedoms. It's what this Parliament needs to denounce and sanction. But what we're seeing here is that the regime is now weakened. If they'd not arrested him, the opposition would have been strengthened. But by arresting him, they've made him into a national hero in a combat against a weakening president. Putin is hesitating in Syria and Belarus. His coffers are emptying, his popularity is falling. Let's look more carefully and we'll see an ageing man who no longer knows how to silence his opposition.
Grazzi, issa għal minuta u nofs Thierry Mariani.
Mr. Thierry Mariani.
Thank you, Madam President. On the 8th of June in 1918, Mr. Solzhenitsyn gave a speech that was considered prophetic. He said that the Western world seems that it is not necessarily the best choice, and it is a symptom of what history is trying to tell us about a society that is threatened or in danger. This is something that is similar to what is happening by the big men of history. And no one is listening to this. And in fact, we can see what's happening with Putin and Russia as a danger for it. Now, what do we really believe? Is Russia a danger for Paris or Berlin? Do we think that the influence of Europe is reducing? And what about the protection of the US and NATO? It seems that Europe is now poised to inflict sanctions. But if we look at the positions that are being taken, it's actually the opposite of the kinds of things that we defend here. We have heard from Mr. Navalny that Ukraine would be Russia, and yes, his poisoning should be investigated according to the legal provisions in place following the investigation in Russia. The EU seems to nonetheless keep all opposition to Putin, and that is not necessarily what diplomacy should do, as it's supposed to uphold the interests of our nations. And if we look at our states and the spectacle of what is happening in terms of the end of the domination, that is precisely what was being declared in that speech at that time that I used at the introduction of my speech. We can see that it's really a question of consternation. Thank you.
Minuta Heidi Hautala,
Mrs. Heidi Hautala, for 1 minute.
President, High Representative, it's very important that this House condemns in its strongest terms the treatment of Alexei Navalny by the Kremlin and the Russian regime. This has been the most severe breach of human rights that one can imagine, an attempted murder by the regime, very well exposed. And now that the European Union has the fresh mechanism on dealing with human rights violations anywhere in the world, we have to put this in action. I think the whole chain of command must be exposed. A lot of it is already known. We also need an international independent investigation into what actually has happened. Now, this is a great opportunity to shed light on the forthcoming elections in Russia. What could happen to all of the opposition? And this Parliament and the European Union has to give all its support to opposition to have a full role in the Russian system, to turn it slowly into a democracy. So elections by September 2021 will be a very crucial moment.
Grazie.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Herman Turch.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam. The arrest of Alexei Navalny when he arrived in Russia is an insult to all of us, to the international community, and particularly to Europe. Europe really needs to think why it is so easy to spit in our faces. Why is our important neighbour able to do that? I mean, we're not weak. We created the Magnitsky Law, but Putin knows that China, at the moment, is violating human rights in much more a brutal way than them. And still, for Christmas, we gave them the gift of an agreement. Cuba detains its opponents all the time. The same in Venezuela, and we give them money with an agreement. Turkey has brutal repression. We complain a lot, but we never sanction them. And Putin knows that he's got Nord Stream, that Nord Stream is still there, with the second